Good morning, everyone. Get ready to start. I'm Councillor Roberto Escobedo. I'm from Nissa, Oregon. I'm a member of the LOC Board of Directors. Welcome this morning to breakout session, Creative Inclusion and Deliberative Local Democracies. I would like to introduce our speakers, Alex Ranieri. She's a program co-director of Healthy Democracy, and then we have Terry Harding, senior planner from the City of Eugene. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Really happy to be here with you all this morning. We're a little bit spread out. We are going to do a short pair share in a little while, so you may be asked to come a little bit closer at some point. I'm Alex Ranieri, program co-director at Healthy Democracy, and just want to first acknowledge we were supposed to have a third presenter with us today, Jose Melendez, who's a professor in the UO School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management, and also has participated in a Healthy Democracy program. Unfortunately, he is sick and not able to make it, so he sends his regrets. Would you mind? Thank you. So by way of introduction, Healthy Democracy, this is our mission statement. We believe in elevating the voices of everyday people, bringing new faces to public decision-making, and designing a more collaborative democracy together. So we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based in Oregon. We do work all over the country, but this is very much our home. And we use democratic lotteries to empower new voices in public decision-making and really guarantee representation across many diversities. We also design and coordinate deliberative processes that prove a more collaborative political system is possible. And we do this by partnering with governments, often cities, counties, and any other organization to convene lottery-selected panels, which are processes that tackle some of our most challenging policy questions, everything under the sun, from housing to healthcare. So a little bit of history about our organization. We created one of the best-known reforms in the field of deliberative democracy, which was the Citizens Initiative Review. It's a program in which a group of everyday folks from around an entire state get together to analyze controversial voter ballot measures and write more trustworthy, balanced information that goes directly into the voter's pamphlet. We've run those since about 2008. Also in 5 US states, 2 other countries internationally, and it became Oregon law in 2011. So the results of this panel went straight into the voter's pamphlet. And it still is one of the most studied deliberative processes in the world. Currently, these days, for about the last 5 years or so, we've focused on local government decision-making. So bringing new forms of democracy to our cities and counties, because we really believe that that's where democracy gets built from the ground up. So a little bit about why we do this work. First of all, probably many of us in the room here know that folks participate in our democracy at vastly different rates. This chart shows rates of volunteering by race and ethnicity. We see that white folks participate at much higher rates than folks of color. This chart shows the same by educational attainment. We see folks with more formal educational background participate at much higher rates than folks with less formal education. And really, who participates is often still a mystery. So this study, actually, worked on under Jose's research project, which looked at local boards and commissions across the state of Oregon and who was actually even recording demographic information. We see at the city and county level, 1/3 or under. So this points to another problem that in most cases, we don't even know who's participating, which means that we may not be hearing from entire communities and not even know it. And nextly, many of us don't see public decision-making as something that we can do. We think that most of our current processes actually devalue our humanity. They require comfort and familiarity with often very rigid procedural norms such as Robert's rules, but not limited to Robert's rules. They assume subject matter expertise, that folks will walk into the room with existing knowledge and information and often positions. And they're kind of, from their core architecture, oriented towards debate rather than collaboration. And really, even for those of us who do participate, who decide we're going to show up at the council meeting or public forum, most of us will never be tapped to really deeply be involved in the details of any policy decision in our entire lives. And no surprise, this all has consequences. So the study of Oregonians' trust in local politicians, and the percentages of folks across different age brackets who agreed with the statement that the people running my community really don't care much about what happens to me. So I know there are probably some electeds in the room here and some staff. This is disheartening, right? Over 50% of all of these age groups agreed with that statement, and more so in the younger age groups. Nationally, I'm sure this isn't a surprise to anyone, we're seeing growing dissatisfaction in democracy in the US. It's been growing for the last decade, but really is over 50% now. But, a little silver lining, we are optimistic about solving problems locally. So this study looked at optimism that folks who hold different political views can come together and solve national or local problems. And national, not so great, about a third. At the local level, we're still a majority that think that folks who, even with vast ideological differences, can actually come together and find common ground. So what we're here to talk to you about today is a new approach to doing democracy, doing democratic decision-making. We call them lottery-selected panels. Around the world, they're known by many names, including citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, policy juries, and many others. And we want to just take a step back for a moment and imagine a democracy in which our public decision-making reflects our diversity, where everybody participates in in-depth policymaking, where expertise is both valued and questioned, and where government is a tool that we all use together rather than an entity out there doing things to us or for us. So before we get into the details of what this process is, I'll talk about just a few principles at its core. And the first is inclusivity. So these processes use really uniquely proactive recruitment methods to meet folks where they are, and design that's based on universal accessibility to get new voices into the room who we typically never hear from. Second, representation. So these processes are guaranteed to reflect many diversities all at once. Next, integrity. So they're based on over 50 years of research of how people do collaborative decision-making together. They're highly transparent, and they're always independently evaluated. Collaboration. They're designed with collaboration in their core architecture. The process is structured, it's iterative, it's guided by a team of local professional moderators, and all of this fosters an atmosphere of respectful and really information-driven exchange. Finally, empowerment. So panels have the authority to govern as many aspects of their process as possible and the ability to impact real policy outcomes. Okay, so now let's talk about the elements of a lottery-selected panel. And there are really two core components here. So on the left, we have who's in the room, and on the right, what happens in the room. First, democratic lotteries are how folks get into the room, and they create a microcosm, kind of a mini public, and reduce common barriers to participation very proactively. On the right, what happens in the room, deliberation really changes the essence of decision-making itself. Panelists have ample time together, they have balanced information from a number of sources, and they have process-based supports to really identify common ground solutions. So we're going to break each of those down even deeper now. So who's in the room? What is a democratic lottery? There's a lot of history to this concept, first of all. Also known as sortition or civic lotteries, this dates way back to ancient Athens in the 6th century. And actually, in ancient Athens, lotteries or sortition were used to select most governing bodies. Aristotle actually thought that elections were oligarchic, but something was only kind of democratic and had that inherent legitimacy when public offices were allocated by lot. In India, a couple centuries later, we see another case study where lotteries were used to select village assemblies, or sabhas. The names of eligible candidates in the community were written on palm leaves, and then a child was asked to pick a leaf with the name of that officer. So fascinatingly, some cultures had almost kind of a sacred view of randomness, that there was something uniquely legitimate and independent about being selected by lottery. And kind of still, is in our culture in the way that we see trials by jury today. So in modern day and age, most of our public processes are one of two things. They're either open to anyone or open by specific invitation. But we think there's one piece of this democracy pie, if you will, that's missing. And that's public processes that are selected by lottery. So we can opt into public forums, we can walk into the council meeting and put our name on the list, or be tapped by a special invitation if we have something in particular to contribute. But we're never invited by chance just to be policymakers on behalf of our community in collaboration with our elected officials. But really, the better metaphor is that we don't have to split up the same democracy pie. We can have more democracy pies. And truly, each of these methods has its benefits and its disadvantages. So processes that are open to anyone are really fundamentally important for our democracy. They're really inclusive, at least in theory. In practice, probably many of us know that it's the same individuals showing up again and again. Specific invitation, also really important for targeting specific communities who've been marginalized or who are experiencing particular impacts, can be very targeted. However, often we see the same individuals being tapped again and again. Lottery selection, as I've said, guarantees new voices, guarantees representative voices in the room, and leaves space for really in-depth deliberation. But of course, that requires time and quite a bit of design. So now we'll break down the democratic lottery into its component pieces. Let's get really practical. So in stage 0, kind of the prep stage, we work with a city to set some demographic categories. Usually these are based on census population data, but we can use other population data, which I think Terry will talk about in her presentation. And we determine some demographic criteria or targets for the panel. Then we craft a really compelling invitation mailer that goes out to between 15 and 20,000 randomly selected residential addresses to invite folks to participate. They register their interest with some demographic information. We collate all those responses, and then we use an open source selection algorithm to create a bunch of different panels, usually 1,000 panels, that all satisfy those demographic targets. And then in a public event, a lottery selection event, we select just one of those panels, so we make that as transparent as possible. And then also really key to who's in the room is reducing barriers to participation. We know that many folks are kept out of public processes by often invisible barriers. In these processes, all costs are covered, so we offer stipends equivalent to a living wage and reimbursements for child, elder care, loaner laptops, hotspots, et cetera. We provide thorough language access, so interpretation in the room and translation of all written materials. Provide direct support to panelists, so one-on-one onboarding sessions just to make sure that everyone feels personally welcome and really valued in the process. Like I said before, we work with small group moderators who are always at tables helping kind of balance participation, make sure that everybody feels welcome and like their voice is being heard. And lastly, quality information. So we really honor folks' lived experience coming into the room, and also give folks the tools and information that they need to feel like experts on the topic, even if they haven't had a formal, educational experience with that topic previously. So these are the demographic factors that we typically use on the top here: gender, race and ethnicity, location of residence, age, educational attainment, housing status, and experience of a disability. And really, the sky's the limit in terms of other demographic factors that could be included in a lottery. And this really shows us why the lottery is so important. So if we look at the top pie charts, top row, race and ethnicity, this is using data from the Eugene Review Panel that Terry will talk about momentarily. On the left, you see the general population of Eugene here. Next to that, we see who responded to the mailing. So those are the voices who opt in, who self-select into public processes. You can see much whiter than the general population. Who was lottery selected evens that out, so we get a more representative sample. And in this case, we actually got a sample that was a bit more diverse than the general population because we used K through 12 demographic data rather than general census. And you get this, a city in one room, or in this case, we were still on Zoom, so a virtual room. Okay, so now moving on to what happens in the room, the deliberative process. These are the steps there. So we work to identify a policy topic and a really specific framing question for the panel with the convening agency. Then once folks are in the room, we do really thorough process orientation. So how do we collaborate? What is critical thinking? And develop some self and group awareness in that room of how our identities interact with each other. Second is a long information gathering phase. So really intended to help panelists understand the landscape of opinions. They hear from background presenters, selected through an independent process, and then are exposed to briefing materials, investigate their own lived experience, and often even hear from the broader community themselves. Then they move into writing a guiding principles report, which are kind of the values and criterias that any future decision they'll make should rest upon or should meet. And then they write policy recommendations entirely in their own words and delivered directly to decision makers for consideration. These are some of the elements that make the deliberative process really unique. One, it's directed by panelists. So as I said, their reports are never edited by us or anyone else. This is very unlike most of the kind of staff-driven or consultant-driven engagement processes that we see. They're time-intensive, so often at least 40 hours, but in many cases over 100 hours together in the room. And the process is designed to kind of help folks actually weigh trade-offs themselves. They're not just coming in with a wish list, they're actually getting into the nitty-gritty of policymaking themselves. And they're designed also to lead to rough consensus. Often we see supermajority, 80+% agreement in these processes. So here's just an overview to recap. An invitation mailer goes out, democratic lottery is held, information gathering process, kind of survey a broad opinion landscape. They deliberate together in intensive, small, large group formats, and then they write recommendations that are delivered directly to decision makers. And really, all of this is designed with the intention to get folks on the same side of the table, kind of addressing a problem together, rather than to come into the room with preformed positions and be hashing it out or kind of giving their two-minute speech without any response or productive engagement. And we think this system has benefits to everybody. So for policymakers, it really surfaces fresh perspectives and untapped ideas. It enhances mutual trust in governance. For stakeholders and advocates, it gives them a new audience, a new group of individuals who are deeply invested in hearing their policy proposals. And it also levels the playing field. For the public, fosters ownership over public decision-making. It presents a new model for actually collaborating with each other, and it increases access for historically marginalized groups. And this isn't just us. There's an international movement working towards lottery-selected democracy. And around the world, these processes are particularly useful in being used in situations where there's a lack of public information, lack of political legitimacy or distrust, there's polarization, stalemate, lack of representation, high complexity, they're often very technical, also well-suited for ethical dilemmas. And while these processes have been used since the 1970s, we've seen really growing momentum, or this kind of deliberative wave, over the last 15 years, with over 600 processes now recorded to date. And importantly, panels can address almost any policy question. So this isn't kind of a one model fits all by any means, but they've been used to address everything from urban planning to transportation to energy policy. And these recommendations produced by panels are often adopted by public authorities. So in over 2/3 of cases, those below or lowest two bars, at least half of the panel's recommendations are adopted by their convening authorities. So panels often create really wise, durable policy decisions and become a true asset to decision makers in that way. So I'm going to talk about a couple case studies, and then Terry is going to take us through a case study in more depth, which happened in Eugene, Oregon a couple of years ago. But just briefly, here are two other local government processes from recent years, one in Milwaukee, Oregon in 2019, on the topic of how city councilors should be compensated. So great topic because council didn't really want to touch it, right? They wanted kind of another independent body of the public to consider this for them. So we convened a panel of 18 folks and worked over the course of 4 days, and they produced a recommendation that City Council voted to adopt as is. Last year in Petaluma, California was the most intensive of these processes to date in the US. It was on the future of a 55-acre fairgrounds property. Very contentious issue. They had reached a stalemate. Nearly everybody in town had a stake in this topic. We convened a panel of 36 that was representative across those 7 demographic factors that I shared, and they worked for about 12 days in total, this time over the course of 2 months. They produced 3 different reports, the first on principles, kind of the values and criteria with rationales, pathways identified specific site use options, and then the final report articulated a preferred land use vision. And participating is really powerful for panelists, too. This is a way of really developing new leaders in our cities. After evaluating the Petaluma process, researchers found that panelists felt a growing sense of community and that they had a say on the panel. And over on the right here, really crucial, 92% of panelists felt that their input was meaningful and important in local decision making. And if you think back to the beginning, if we contrast that with how many folks feel disillusioned and unheard in our politics right now, that is really significant. So here's a quote from the mayor of Petaluma. It's been a huge commitment, and it was a big leap into another way of working together. This process seems to move to collaboration from competition, and I think that's the only way we move forward. So that's it for my slides, and what we want to ask you to do before Terry comes and takes the mic is to turn to someone next to you. We like to process you even at a conference. Turn to someone next to you and take 5 minutes just to answer this question. What are your initial kind of impressions, questions, or concerns about this model? And we'll call you back at 9:33.
Hi, everyone. We're going to pick it back up here in just a second. It's great to hear the chatter in the room. I promise you'll have more time to chat in a moment. So my name is Terry Harding. I'm the principal planner for Community Planning and Design team here in Eugene, Oregon. And I'm going to talk to you about the process that we used for the middle housing legislation here in Eugene, which included work with Alex and Healthy Democracy, among lots of other public engagement tools. So to put this in context for you, the reason we wanted to use a new process for hearing from more voices for the Middle Housing Project is because of the history of how we have done zoning and land use policy across the nation, but also in Oregon. So as many of us have learned, the planning profession has a long history of exclusion, from laws to policies to zoning regulations, redlining, exclusive land use process requirements, and in Oregon, this history was especially harmful with direct exclusion of non-white people in the state constitution. And that was in the Constitution from 1844 through 1926. Although this explicit exclusion and discrimination are illegal today, the negative impacts are still affecting our communities through the legacy of exclusionary policies, codes, and processes. Most planners of my generation and older were not taught this information in planning school, nor was it included in the K-12 public school curriculum. But this is starting to change. Publications such as Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, his new book, Just Action, and articles by lots of people, including University of Oregon Law School professor Sarah Adams Shane, have documented zoning's racist and exclusionary roots and suggested policy changes to remedy past harms. So here in Oregon, housing equity advocates pushed for statewide zoning reform to end exclusionary or single-family only zoning. The middle housing legislation aimed to increase equity through a fundamental shift in the way Oregon communities plan for housing. And more legislation has followed: the Climate-Friendly and Equitable Communities rulemaking, Oregon Housing Needs Assessment, and others. So how have local governments responded to these big shifts in policy? I'm going to dive into Eugene's experience using the lottery-selected panels, but first I want to hear just a little bit from who's in the room. First of all, how many of you are elected officials? Most of you. How many are staff? Okay. And then who have I missed? Who else? Sorry? Committees, volunteers, advocates. Okay. So when you guys think of a process, any process that's going to a local decision maker, who are the types of people you usually hear from? They come to your meetings, they speak at the microphone. Shout them out. Rich, white, white, educated, entitled, older, vested interests. Do you mean paid interests?
Usually are somebody who is
Business owners. Okay, good. You're very warmed up. Who's missing? So who's not coming to your meetings? Compadres.
Single mothers.
Single mothers.
Kids or young children.
Youth, Okay. People with disabilities. And lower income folks. Well, that seems pretty common to what we were experiencing in Eugene. So yeah, those were some of the reasons that we wanted to expand our tools for who we could hear from and really set up structures that would help us hear from those voices that we were not hearing from. Okay, my notes are a little bit wonky here. Thanks for your patience. Okay. So diving into the story in Eugene, using a lottery-selected panel as a tool for public engagement on a project that was statewide in nature, statewide zoning reform, in a predominantly white community, Eugene, during a pandemic and amidst a resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. That's the context that we launched this work in. It was July 2020. So this picture is a slide of us presenting our ideas for public involvement to the City Council. And at this first meeting, we decided to introduce the topic of the racist history of exclusionary zoning, along with some ideas about how to engage a more representative and equitable cross-section of the public for this not uncontroversial middle housing project. That's setting the stage. So as most of you probably know, in 2019, the legislature passed House Bill 2001, referred to as the Middle Housing Bill. It eliminates single-family only zoning in cities around Oregon, and it's the first bill to require statewide zoning reform. It has since been replicated in other states. It came with a 2-year timeline for implementation and a set of prescriptive administrative rules that were still being written as we were launching our public engagement. So just as a refresher, most of us are probably familiar with the term missing middle housing. The House bill did define it for us. So middle housing was defined to include duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and townhouses. And as of the deadline of July 1st, 2022, middle housing is now allowed by right in most large city neighborhoods. In Eugene, that looks like this. So most of the city is zoned R1, low-density residential, and it's those areas outlined in the slide on the right. It affects neighborhoods in every ward, and over 90% of our residential land is zoned R1. It used to be mostly single-family, but other types of housing were allowed through various additional, like conditional use permits and public hearings and things like that. So many of these neighborhoods in Eugene and other cities around the state have not allowed for a mix of housing types that historically were allowed or housing choices until recently. So this is a slide that kind of documents what you all shouted out. Our usual engagement methods tended to focus on roundtable groups, technical advisory committees, large in-person events, night meetings, volunteered from self-selected people like Alex was talking about, folks who had already a vested interest or a lot of background knowledge about a topic. In the past, we tended to rely on these groups and committees that included a lot of the same voices over and over again. And a common thread was that our engagement relied on volunteered time from self-selected people and assumed a lot of background knowledge. It resulted in people showing up to meetings with their minds already made up, with proclamations of what was right and wrong, and aside from being combative, completely lacked the deliberative and relationship-building qualities that we were looking for. So we needed to try something new. We had to do better. We wanted to engage folks from all backgrounds all over the city, make it easy, exciting to engage, encourage thoughtful deliberation, and explain the why behind our policy choices. The presentation of the public involvement plan began in June of 2020, as I said. It was a pivotal time. The pandemic had just recently begun, and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement necessitated that we as a planning team examine the inequities within and that resulted from our profession. We decided that we could no longer move forward with our planning projects without first looking back and acknowledging that committing to redressing exclusion in our zoning codes and public processes. This lens shaped the construction and the content of the public involvement plan for the Middle Housing Project. The plan included a section on the racist and exclusive history of residential zoning, 2 new panels that centered new voices, one, Healthy Democracy, and another that I will talk about as the Equity Panel, and a commitment to spread awareness about the equity component of land use planning. We asked ourselves, who are we not hearing from? Where are the gaps in our communication? One of the key components of the public involvement plan was the lottery selected panel that would be facilitated by Healthy Democracy. The panel would be selected via a blend of lottery and an algorithm that would ensure composition of key demographic factors representing the makeup of our community. And it was going to look really different than the typical technical advisory committee or public hearing. But it wasn't really a slam dunk. At the beginning, we heard a lot of reactions to this idea. The reactions were mixed, honestly. Especially the lottery selected panel was very different than anything we had tried in the past. Some folks said that land use might be too complicated for an everyday person to engage with. Others were worried that they would be replaced. Some neighborhood defenders voiced concern with no longer being centralized in the process, and they were right. This was a threatening thing. That was the intention, so we proceeded anyway. The first comment from a city councilor was that they were disappointed that we made this about race. Despite the mixed reactions, there was general support from the commission, the planning commission, and lots of support from city leadership. It would have been impossible to do this without support from our city manager and department executives, and our mayor. So a little bit more about the panel demographics. Once we were told that we were able to work with Healthy Democracy and assemble this lottery selected panel, it was pretty amazing. Alex mentioned the process that we did live to select the panel. It was in the pandemic, everything was on Zoom. We did it on Facebook Live, and the first time it completely crashed. It did not work at all. We had to just cancel the meeting and try again like a week later. But that was okay. We were committed to making it work. We landed on these 7 key demographics. We knew that they weren't all inclusive, but we wanted to start somewhere. In Eugene, we sent 7,500 letters to random households all around Eugene. And then Healthy Democracy did the work on their end to create the different panels that Alex talked about. The results were that we had 8 panelists, a total of 29 people participated on the panel. We had 8 people under 25. That's amazing. It's amazing. We had representatives from all the wards, so all councilors were happy to see people from their ward in these being represented. 1 in 6 experienced a disability. Half the panelists were renters. That's amazing, amazing. Multiple gender identities. Sorry. Just keep losing my place. Thanks for your patience. It's because I'm on the wrong slide. I got lost, you guys. I'm so sorry. Well, I just got lost in my whole presentation. It's very weird. Okay, well, I think we'll just move on. You can click right on mine. It's right there, your slides. Okay. Yeah, it's the same. I have the same up on my computer. So we'll just say that we had folks that met all these categories, included multiple gender identities. We used local school age demographics, as Alex talked about, and the educational attainment ranged from no high school diplomas. We had folks that were immigrants, folks that hadn't completed high school, all the way to people with advanced degrees, including Jose. I'm so sad Jose is not here. Jose received one of these 7,500 letters, and he happens to be a professor of equitable engagement and an immigrant from the university. It was just an amazing aligning of the stars. So he participated in the panel also while he was researching this stuff and speaking about it as from his identity as an immigrant. So just really cool. Maybe we'll do this again next year and he'll be well, but it's really worth listening to Jose talk about his experience. Okay. So a little bit on Eugene's demographics. Alex mentioned this. We have census data on the left, Eugene population, and on the right is K-12 student population. You can see just on the very first slide, it's way more diverse, it's way more non-white in our student populations. We have two main school districts in Eugene, Eugene and Bethel. Bethel is even more diverse than the Eugene 4J district, and this is a combination of the two of them, weighted for the size of the district. This was the idea of our manager of equity and community engagement. She suggested that we do this. Healthy Democracy was totally on board, and I think this sets a good practice for long-range planning, because really we are planning for the future population, not planning for the past, not planning for the aging population. That being said, it wasn't enough, because we still have a predominantly white community where folks are not, although wildly more represented in the room of Healthy Democracy, they are not in the majority. And so we did create another space called the Equity Roundtable, where these folks could participate. This thing is just going crazy. We're gonna go, oh, there we go, okay, yay. Even with using school-age demographics for the panel, it was still a white-dominated space. So staff created a panel outside of Healthy Democracy, and we called it the Equity Roundtable. We wanted to create a space that was not dominated by people with privilege and gave a platform to voices that have been excluded or dismissed from the planning processes of the past. We as staff were also not the right people to lead this. You can see I'm white presenting, I'm white identifying, and we hired 3 women of color from the university to facilitate these conversations. It was really a good move. We are fortunate to have these community partners, LIE Community Consulting, who led the process and were experts in facilitation. Similar to the lottery-selected panel, the Equity Roundtable participants were compensated for their time. I think I completely glossed over that, but both these folks and the people on the panel were paid an hourly wage to participate, and that was really important because it's a barrier for a lot of folks to be able to spend time on policy-making projects or civic engagement without having your basic needs met. So I'm a huge advocate for that. Okay, I have a little clip to play for you. Hopefully this will work. Or maybe Scott's going to play it.
When we grew up and we outgrew the house, it wasn't something that we had to show my kids. You know, it was like, okay, well, Grandma doesn't live in that house anymore because, you know, we outgrew it and she doesn't need to pay for a big house, you know? And I think that the idea of having the ability for middle housing in general opens up the doors for people like myself who may not have a down payment for a house and may not have equity in any assets to bring forth to provide, you know, a better size house that's more what I want. I shared this in our roundtable, and when my children were all small and I was a full-time student, I lived in low-income housing. And I
Thanks. So that was just a 1-minute clip of a member of the Equity Roundtable, Isis Barone, who spoke to the Planning Commission. And we also had folks speak directly to City Council. We had folks from both the Healthy Democracy panel and the Equity Roundtable, various kind of constituencies. And the feedback we got about that was really positive. The decision makers really, really, really appreciated hearing directly from the people who were involved in these panels, in addition to just getting their reports.
when we grew up and we outgrew the house, it wasn't something that.
I guess I did that. This is my last slide. So we did it. We actually resulted in a 8-0 vote at City Council. They adopted a middle housing ordinance that included recommendations from the panels. An example of a recommendation they included was an extra incentive for affordable housing, extra building height for middle housing, beyond what was required in the prescriptive rules. We also achieved a State Achievement in Community Engagement, or ACE award from DLCD that was awarded in June of 2022. However, there is still an appeal pending, and we're working through that, but the ordinance is in effect, middle housing is being constructed. In addition to building projects, there are also middle housing land divisions happening, and so that was a companion law that required cities to allow new middle housing units to be sold individually. So that's a way that housing can be built without going through the condo process, which is a huge advantage. Lastly, another lottery selected panel is proposed. We're working to get funding to do this, and other cities are asking about this. I've talked about this at various conferences. I've had calls with cities in California and Washington. People really want to know about this. And the last point I'd like to make is that the cost of doing this is not as high as the cost to do the technical work, and it's absolutely critical to achieve the goals that we have around equity and participation. I think the cost of not doing it is way higher than the cost of doing it politically and from a social justice perspective, and really hope that we'll see more and more funding directed towards projects that intentionally make processes more open and equitable. Thank you. Yes. Oh, now we have a video.
Yeah. So in lieu of Jose's presentation, we still wanted to bring you voices from panelists who had participated in a past process. So we're going to put on a video that's about 9 minutes of panelists from the Petaluma Fairgrounds Advisory Panel that I talked about earlier, telling the story of the process in their own words. And then after that, we will open it up for questions.
I got a mailer, and I didn't realize the fairground were in trouble. And so I thought, well, I wanted to be here for my grandkids and for their kids, and it was an important decision to make. And I'd never been on anything like this before. I don't watch city council meetings, and so I thought I should be better informed on what's going on in my own community.
I feel like democracy, it's complicated. I just felt like I shouldn't get involved.
I was involved in politics ever since I was 16 years old, back home in Zimbabwe.
I was worried that it was just a way that the city was using to shine us on, that they're going to listen to us and then choose to do whatever they want anyway.
You know, seeing just a majority of greatly different people, I expected there to be a lot more pushback on certain things going into this.
It's kind of a microcosm of the big picture, of big community, big society, of the world to be in this environment. You know, there's going to be some people that trigger each other. There's going to be some people who process through feeling. You have to learn to have patience and listen. And if you don't have those skills, it can be really taxing. So I just think it's part of community.
But for the most part, it's been a really nice, engaging experience, like meeting people from all walks of life in the community, being able to like work together to figure out where our common goals and values are, and like from there, like over time formulating a plan day by day, bit by bit. It's really satisfying to see it all come to fruition from all of your work.
There was definitely the guiding where we had the beginning was information gathering. And so in different forms as far as presenters, speakers, documents. So through the beginning was definitely information, and it was structured that way. So we did workshops, learning about biases or these kinds of things, but we weren't really expected to have an opinion or necessarily start really working on stuff pretty early on the first few times we met.
The tools we were given to do this process are amazing. We have information from City Council, from initiatives on the table right now, from reports from the fairgrounds to our big giant sticky board, which we love because we can post all of our ideas on there and then get feedback from the other team members.
We got access to information that I wouldn't know how to get otherwise, or that may not be released otherwise. And then there's also been surveys and input from the community that, I mean, sitting and talking to your neighbors in a bar isn't the same, right? Meeting out on the street, it's all happenstance, whereas here it's collected information.
Then as the arrows started overlapping, and we were now starting to do the work that was coming out, not just coming in, but working on the outcome of what we were here for.
I really appreciate the process that they went through for that, because it really broke it down, and it made it very, we're all people with our own lives and our own opinions, and the way we see things is different, and some of us, I'm sure, came in with preconceived notions. They highly encouraged us not to try to keep an open mind. And I think their approach to try to break down the process into these little bite-sized pieces where you knew what the big picture was. We knew what our deliverable kind of was supposed to look like, but to let us kind of live in the moments and really go, okay, what are we trying to accomplish here? And remind us at each little step that we're just trying to work together to accomplish a common goal at that time, regardless of what our preconceived notions are, but still give us space to express our opinions. But it's nice because then you don't have to bottle it up throughout the whole thing. If you feel really strongly about something, you can say it.
So to in the process of like coming out with big concepts and then nailing things down into actual uses and options and things, it's been a good exercise, and again, you know, I haven't felt like it's washed out any of the things I think are important.
My favorite part of this process thus far has been figuring out the principles and then working on the options to that principle, and watching how we as a group are defining it, like whittling it away every day a little more. That has to be my most favorite part.
I know I said it once in a large group meeting, right? Part of our job is to dream. And And as a whole, I think we've been pretty good at that. And now we're narrowing it down to how those dreams fit together.
First thing is, you have 36 people, different backgrounds. Most of them we didn't know each other, and we are able to work together.
I like the process. It has worked out. And I don't think anybody has lost their feeling that they have a say, you know?
I think my favorite part of this process so far is the ability for everyone to speak and voice their opinion, and the ability for everyone in this panel together to accept that everyone's visions are different.
I am a big fan of healthy democracy because I did not come in here with any kind of political background or understanding the language, and they have 100% supported every single person here with a great attitude.
It's a great process for democracy. I hope that there's many more things are resolved or decided through this process. Ultimately, I think no matter what happens, I feel like the public, the community, will feel that they had an avenue for their feelings and thoughts, no matter how minor, from a ginormous expo hall to a butterfly garden, were represented and heard in this process.
Just with politics the way it is, where they don't seem to want to communicate at all. And I think this is the perfect way to get politics not so political.
The group is not necessarily the same people that seek out city government to be involved in things. And so I like that. I don't think anybody on this panel will not participate in another community thing ever. Everybody is more likely to participate.
We're more invested.
And more invested, in the community. And if that continues to happen, what community improvements will we see? If citizens actually are engaged.
I still tear up a little bit every time I watch that. Thank you so much. So I just actually wanted to say first, before we open up for questions for the rest of our time here, that we at Healthy Democracy, we are a nonprofit. Our mission is to spread the word about these kinds of processes, and we could just watch the news instead. Is to spread the word about these processes. And we love having meetings, kind of coaching sessions, just to hear about what's on your plate, what you're struggling with, and talk through how kind of representation, deliberation may work in your context. So I'm going to pass around a sign-in sheet just to weave across the tables while we do our Q&A. And there are no need to sign up, but feel free to leave your name, your email address, and there are 2 columns where you can say yes or no. The first is if you'd like to be contacted, which is with an offer of a coaching session with one of us at Healthy Democracy. And the second is if you'd like to be on our mailing list. So I'll distribute those, and now we'll turn it over to questions. And thank you, Angela, for helping be our runner.
Hey, Mark Sandmiller, City of Hood River. I guess this is for you, Alex, actually. So, which is Healthy Democracy, I assume, is providing facilitation services for communities, or is there a DIY kit, or how would one start with this besides checking yes in that one column?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So yes, typically we partner with the city and do everything, kind of manage the entire process from running the lottery to hiring a local facilitation team and kind of managing all the logistics of the process. And we realize that that may not be feasible in some contexts, and so there's no sort of kit available at this time. But we definitely are interested in opportunities to build capacity within existing staff members, local municipalities in various ways. So that could look like different things, kind of how much we turned over to staff. There's also, depending on the nature of the political question, sometimes some strategic decisions to make there about how it would be perceived by the broader community to have certain functions and facilitation turned over to staff. Sometimes that's not a great move, just if it's a particularly politically dicey topic. And having that outside independent facilitating body is really critical to the process being successful. But also really want to embed these as kind of systemic reforms within cities. And so very open to talking about how to build capacity in more lasting ways. Yeah.
So David Klein, I'm currently interim city manager in Cottage Grove. So I've been harboring an opinion for a lot of years, and it feels like you've maybe validated some of that with your slides. When you talk about when you show the slide that shows that it really has become somewhat generational in terms of the trust in government, though the breakdown, certainly the younger you are, the less you trust your government. And you also showed the slide that the evolution of this lack of trust really accelerated post-turn of the century. And part of my personal belief is that it's got, that goes to the heart of our education system in many ways, because we've restricted our curricula to the 3 R's, teaching to the test in the early 2000s. And I'm wondering if that isn't a place of an opportunity for you to present your information with jump in there a little more, feeling like, that's the audience as much as anything that needs to hear it. I love what you've done. I've been in the business for over 40 years, and frankly, your model of public engagement never occurred to me, and it looks great. And I also want to talk to you about Cottage Grove if we run out of questions.
So let me just make sure I'm understanding the question correctly, is have we thought about doing education in younger populations specifically to kind of build that mutual trust? Great. It's a great question. I mean, as a nonprofit, we do various kinds of civic education, and certainly think for a number of reasons that it's impactful to engage young folks about the mechanics of governance and different ways of doing democracy. So I certainly agree with you strategically that that's an important population to be talking to and kind of exposing to new models. And interesting, where I thought you were going initially in your question, which maybe I'll address, is the impact of education and exposure to information in trust in governance. And I think that's really, I think we've touched on it a lot, but I think that's a critical piece in our processes, is that once you kind of get out of that myopic view of policy or position, partisanship, and see that wide range of opinions and hear from, a lot of different folks, that kind of trust in our ability to actually listen to each other, and that includes kind of, formal elected bodies' ability to listen to constituents and vice versa, that immediately seems to increase. So, Terry, do you have anything to add?
Add one piece, which is we have thought about the concept of citizen academies, or the last panelist in your video talked about this ongoing effect of panelists getting excited about engaging and telling their friends, and sort of the idea of a civic academy, I think does resonate. And so I think there are opportunities to take components, values to affect a system I'm a huge fan of working directly with Healthy Democracy, and we're not always going to have the funding to do it. And so I think there's also ways that we can adapt lessons into our processes.
Rick Mark, Lincoln City Council. I have a question, but just a comment on that. What struck me about that growth in distrust since 1995 is that, to me, it mirrors the use of the internet, which amplifies misinformation and all that. And I see there are sessions later today on how to combat that, so I'm actually signed up for some of those. But my question was more of a logistical thing. You sent out, in a city of over 100,000 people, you sent out 75 invitations, and I was wondering, how did you know who to send them to, if this is a random process, and what was the response rate? I think you might have touched on that, but how successful was that?
I'm just going to clarify, it was 7,500 letters. But the response rate.
Yeah, so in Eugene it was 7,500, and I think my slide said typically these days we're doing more like 15 to 20,000, just so we get enough responses to really easily be able to satisfy those demographic targets. And typically in the US we see between a 2.5 and 3.5% response rate. And that's much higher in other parts of the world, so we're hoping we get there eventually. And let's see, was there another aspect of your question as well?
So I was wondering, so you
Oh.
2.5% response rate, and then really where I wanted to go
Right.
was, then how did you know who?
Right.
Was there a process to select that you had to make sure it was diverse? And that actually
Right.
created a whole other question in my mind,
Mhm.
which is if you didn't get selected, then are you opening yourself up to,
Mhm.
racial accusations because you accepted that person and not this person?
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so for the recording, just to reiterate, the two questions were, how are those residential addresses that received the invitation mailer selected, and then how do folks respond to not being selected? So the first piece, so we typically work with the city's GIS department, and then this is completely random. So this kind of sortition process or lottery process uses actually 3 different stages of randomization. And the first is in who receives those invitations. So that 15 to 20 or 7,500 are completely random households. We're not stratifying at all at that point. And then folks respond, to generate or to say that they're interested in participating. And we use the second stage of randomization, but this time with those demographic criteria. It's actually an open source algorithm. You can look it up and play with it online. It's called Panelot to run the civic lottery. And that generates those 1,000 panels that all reflect the community according to those 7 demographic targets. And then we select just one of those panels. And so everybody has their little number and can tune into the selection event and, just like watching to see if your lottery number is called on cable news, which I've never done. It's intended to be this exciting kind of kickoff where folks feel invested, know that they might be called to serve, and can get excited about that. And to answer your second question, there's absolutely, some folks are very disappointed if they aren't selected, but we try to make that entire process as transparent as possible. We publish, who's on every single one of those 1,000 panels. It's an open source platform where anyone can play around with the software we're using. So typically folks understand, even if they're disappointed, that they weren't, it's not that they were hand selected or not, it's that there was a process by which folks were randomly selected to be on the panel. And that doesn't mean that folks who, didn't receive the invitation mailer or weren't selected can't participate. So panels often kind of host their own community engagement, and there are often other city-sponsored engagement opportunities for folks to kind of self-select into as well. So we really see that as kind of a parallel process.
Thank you. I'm Mary McGinnis, and I'm a city councilor in Rockaway Beach, and I have 3 quick comments. Before I make those, thank you very much for this presentation. We need this in city government so much to make it so inclusive and democratic. Thank you. But to the man who spoke about the 3 R's, I just retired a couple of years ago from 45 years of teaching public high school government and civics, and the model that we see in the news is not what's going on in our classrooms. I invite everyone in government to go and visit your local schools and see what's going on. For the last 20 years, I used models very similar to what we heard today in my classroom, and most teachers do. The second point is you as a city councilor can invite young people to become involved in city. I just last week visited all the social studies classes in Neocani School District, had a Google Slides about how city council works. I gave them a card, and like an index card on one side at the beginning. I asked them to write down for me how they would want city council, what would they want us to do to make the city more livable for them. At the end of the presentation, at the end of the class period, on the back side, I asked them how they wanted to get involved in with a city council. Every single student wrote something on the front and the back of those cards, and I will take it to heart. And many of them came up to me afterwards and shook my hand and thanked me for reaching out to them. So there's a lot you can do. And then my third one is, because I use these democratic processes the last 20 years in my classroom, there's a big growth and learning period. It scared a lot of people, scared parents, it scared students at first, and it will happen in city government too. So I just wanted to say there's a transference, but when we worked through those scary moments at the beginning, it was the most powerful thing I did in 45 years of teaching, and I think it can become using democratic processes like this can become the most powerful thing in our city governments too. Just thank you.
Thank you for running that over. Thank you for such a really interesting presentation. And like David here at the table, this is completely revolutionary to me. I've never heard about anything like this. So framing context for my question though, my name is David Patty. I'm a city councilor in a town of about 8,400 people in Staten, Oregon. I don't know if any of you have heard of me. So, you know, I've really appreciated hearing about what this looked like in Eugene. And as somebody who frequently tries to engage in populations that aren't at the table at city council meetings for the last 4.5 years, you know, I've been trying to change that through introduction of additional language materials and things like that to include those people. But my question is this: what would you say are pitfalls and challenges in a community like mine where funding is an issue, things like that? What can Healthy Democracy do for a town like ours? You know, because we have tons of issues that I would love to hear from the public in exactly this format. So if you could maybe briefly just touch on that, that would be awesome.
One thing I would say is that Oregon is mostly small towns, and so the funding agencies, DLCD in particular, are really interested, and there are some of them at this conference, in making this more accessible to smaller cities. So talk to your DLCD rep about help with funding.
Yeah, it's true. I think that's a great point. I think maybe I'll add 2 other things. One is that there are other funding streams for these kinds of processes. So they're still very much, you know, even though they've been around for 50 years, also in the US, we are way behind most of the rest of the world in actually implementing more of these processes. So there's a lot of funding interest in making them happen. So I would say if you're interested, get in touch with us, and we are, you know, networked with a wide variety of folks who are interested in seeing these happen in more places, and new models, different kinds of cities, you know, with different political environments and sizes, use them. And also, I think one of our one of our goals is to create models that are more accessible for smaller towns, and I think that's very much possible. Each of these processes is highly custom designed for the specific place and for the topic, and typically we don't want to do any fewer than maybe 4 days of deliberation, but even that, you can find ways of making that a lot more financially feasible in a small city. So, short answer, let's talk.
Awesome. Jason Schneider, I'm a freelance consultant and facilitator and also a former city councilor of a city of about 25,000 people on the shores of Lake Superior. This topic really interests me, so I really appreciate the work that both of you are doing towards this. The previous question about how do we scale back is of strong interest, and so hopefully that information gets sent out. My other question is, this seems to be mostly used in a policy advisory role rather than, I'll just say, upsetting the apple cart of traditional power within the city structure in entirety. So how, instead of just pulling people into a policy advisory space, can we pull them into using this model? Planning commissions, city councils, are there opportunities or examples that has been used in or could be used in to integrate the lottery selection process into the actual people making the decisions to change, sorry for the term, but the old boys club that a lot of our communities face?
Can I have that one? I really want to answer that one. There's so many questions within what you just asked, but one is, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of processes in place, boards and commissions in particular, that have very established structures. And then the whole city administration and council, city manager form of government, at least in Eugene, it's a bureaucracy that has many layers and many decades of structure built around it. So when we first met with Healthy Democracy, it was fall of 2019. And the first introduction to this was city staff level. And so a group of city staff met, we talked about it, we talked about what projects could work, how could we integrate this. There were concerns from lots of people. Nonetheless, we were encouraged by our city manager in particular to take it to the Planning Commission. And so there was a Planning Commission meeting. Planning Commissioners had questions about it, but it's a public meeting and it's broadcast online. And so all of those questions were welcome, I feel like, and were kind of brought up at the very beginning so that we would have more success in implementing the model later. That being said, we continue to have questions and criticisms about how this interacts with the boards and commissions. And we had to be very intentional in that this was an additional layer with additional process, additional funding. It's also tricky to have the contract set up so that folks that are acting as panelists are not actually public officials. There's a third party. They're panelists who are making recommendations to staff. We were not obligated, actually, to take those forward to City Council. We did, but we were not obligated to. And so there's legal constraints, too, on the process. But I think that's an excellent question and one that continues to need to be studied, because I think ultimately there's a lot of structures and places where the values can be implemented.
Maybe I'll add a tiny bit to that part of our field. I wouldn't characterize Healthy Democracy as being part of that section, is very interested in using lotteries to select city councils and existing boards and commissions, and actually do more of a replacement than an addition to current systems. I think, as Terry mentioned, in most of the contexts we work in, it being an additive layer, it being an advisory layer, is the way that this kind of very new concept that already is challenging for folks to wrap their heads around is getting implemented, and that's what we've seen all over the world. There are, I don't think, any examples internationally of elected bodies, or what were elected bodies being selected by lot. However, there are a couple very cool examples. One in Paris that just got started last year, where a citizens' assembly, same thing, is essentially kind of a parallel body to council. So they don't have any formal decision-making power, but they can call their own kind of mini ad hoc assemblies on certain topics. They have decision-making over some aspects of their participatory budgeting process, some aspects of the budget. So they do have some kind of core functions that a council would typically hold. And so there are institutionalized, kind of more systemic models like that being implemented around the world in really exciting ways.
Thank you all for coming and speaking today. This has just been really, really amazing. Sorry. Virginia Stapleton, City of Salem. Both of the last two questions kind of stole mine. You guys are brilliant. Thank you so much. One was just, how do cities pay for this, right? I mean, you are not, this isn't news to you that all cities in Oregon are struggling. And so really curious, and I think I'll just ask a direct question on this, which is, how much did it cost Eugene to do this program? And then also, I couldn't agree more with the boards and commissions thing. Right now we're looking at taking a look at all of our boards and commissions, because there's literally some that we don't even know what they do, right? They've been there for so long. And so trying to turn over that apple cart that we were talking about, and just really have a new way of looking at this, I think is really fantastic. But just direct, how much did it cost you guys to do it?
Our contract was $75,000, and it was wildly over budget by the end of the project. So we started, and I think Healthy Democracy was willing to go over because it was a pilot. But $75,000, they fundraised a third of it. DLCD gave a third of it in grant form, and the city put in a third of it. And then, like I said, it cost a lot more than that, and it's absolutely worth it. Yeah. Oh, and then, of course, in-kind staff hours to support the process. Maybe a quarter of my time and one other planner's time over the course of the meetings. But the planner's role in the meetings was as an observer, and we've learned kind of how to make that function better, I think. But we were not directly facilitating, and we were not involved in the small group conversations. So the staff time was relatively light compared to other fully staff-supported boards and commissions.
Okay, you're back to me. Before I retire, two things, and Angela told me to hurry. I'll try my best. So two things. One, the city that I retired from, and I'm sort of retired because I'm back working, was Independence, Oregon. And we're a very diverse community, and diverse Latino, Caucasian, and we're roughly 40% Latino. Anyway, long story short, we were trying to do a parks master plan update, and we used a traditional survey approach to try and inform that process. When reviewing the response, felt like we really weren't getting the response rate that we wanted in our engagement process, as you've noted, it wasn't robust. So we tried something, intercept surveys at Latino events. So we have a traditional fiesta every year in the community, and we also went to the Spanish language church. Wanted to get your comment on that approach, because we were able to get quite the enhanced response rate to our survey. We ended up with about 15% response overall in the community. Second one goes to where I am now in Cottage Grove. We are in the midst of what may amount to a recall election. It's over the homeless issue in our community, like in many communities. And anything we would do prior to election would be perceived as fairly political. But I'm wondering, in the aftermath of an election like that, as a community healing process, if this would make some sense to come back in and do, revisit the community and see what, in the aftermath.
Interesting. Yeah, I can try to very briefly address that first question, which, I mean, that sounds like a great approach, and I think this takes me back to the democracy pies. We really don't think that this should replace open forums or targeted stakeholder outreach. I think there's really a need for all three of those methods. And so it sounds like what you did was some community-specific outreach, and those folks probably had a very specific perspective to share on the topic. And it's just a unique and I think equally valid thing to have a group that isn't community specific but is broadly representative of the entire public in one room, kind of negotiating those differences together themselves, rather than, you know, staff going out to different communities, taking in that input and then kind of negotiating or mediating or summarizing themselves, right? And gosh, I'm not sure if I have a great answer to the second piece. I think that could be really interesting.
Yeah, well, not touching the recall issue, but it is happening all over the place. I think the idea of this kind of a model as a healing, community-oriented space is really interesting. The other thought that occurred to me was universities have teams of folks that sometimes are very affordable to help small communities. So if Jose were here, he might be like wanting to touch base with you afterwards too. Yeah, I think that's all I have at the moment.
Yeah.
We're out of time too. Do you have a role thanking people? Yeah. It's on.
I don't, this one.
Need it? That one's on. Okay.
Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. It was really good. A lot of good information. So please take a moment and provide us with your feedback on today's session. You can do this by clicking on the session in your app. On the feedback button, if you do not have the feedback button, add the session to your conference agenda. Up next, today's conference program and network break, followed by a breakout session starting at 11. Thank you for joining us this morning. Enjoy the rest of your day at the 98 LOC Annual Conference. Thank you for your attendance.